Hey there, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Morgan Radford, and you're watching NBC News Now. We start this hour in Minneapolis, where student activists gather on a local bridge hanging a banner to honor and remember George Floyd. Meanwhile, more witnesses taking the stand in the Derek Chauvin murder trial today. George Floyd's girlfriend, Courtney Ross, sharing emotional details about their relationship, as well as their addiction to opioids. We also heard from a local paramedic describing what he saw at the scene of Floyd's arrest.
From what I could see where I was at, I didn't see any breathing or movement or anything like that.
Did he appear to be unresponsive to you at that point in time?
From what I could tell, just standing from a distance, yes.
Well, after nearly 4 days of testimony, one theme is consistent. Witnesses tell the court they wish they could have done more to prevent George Floyd's death. Floyd's brother telling NBC News that he believes people are shell-shocked by what they saw that day.
Everything is painful and agony, the same thing that the witnesses had to go through. They're shell shocked for the future. They'll always have this in their mindset. They will never be able to get this out, especially those minors. There's no justification why a person should put their knee and all of their weight on a man's neck until they pass. He was tortured to death. You clearly seen that in the video. There's no reason that he shouldn't be convicted, and we need justice.
Floyd's brother saying he was tortured to death. Let's go now to NBC News correspondent Megan Fitzgerald, who's been covering the trial from Minneapolis. Megan, it is great to have you with us this afternoon. And so far, we've listened to a handful of witnesses today. So walk us through some of the highlights.
Well, Morgan, let's start with the afternoon. That's when jurors heard from 3 first responders. And most notably is Derek Smith. He is the Hennepin County paramedic who testified and is seen in that video responding to George Floyd as the officers are on top of him. He checked for the pulse, and he told the jury that there was no pulse and that he believed that George Floyd was dead. He then continued to talk about the life-saving measures that they did inside the ambulance. And at no point did George Floyd's status change. And then also, early this morning, court kicked off with emotional testimony, as you mentioned, from George Floyd's longtime girlfriend, Courtney Ross. She was very emotional in describing the man that he was, and she was also very transparent in talking about their addiction with opioids. She also revealed that in March of 2020, George Floyd actually overdosed on opioids, spending 5 days in the hospital. Morgan.
Megan, I want to hear a little bit more from her. Can we go ahead in the control room and roll a little bit about what we heard? Because that was a pretty powerful moment today. And we heard her explain how their problems with chronic pain is what led them to that opioid addiction that you just described. Can we pull that up in the control room, please, so we can hear a little bit of that?
He said, well, can I pray with you? I thought I was so tired. We had been through so much, my sons and I. And this kind person just to come up to me and say, can I pray with you? When I felt alone in this lobby, it was so sweet.
Megan, the bottom line is that today, those of us around the country were locked into that trial, seeing those emotional testimonies. What is that like for you there in Minneapolis, the city where all of this was sort of the shot heard around the world? How are people there reacting?
Yeah, it's a great question. We talk a lot about the trauma that we are seeing inside the courtroom from several witnesses that are breaking down, expressing regret that they wish that they could have done more. That trauma certainly is not contained to just the courtroom. It is certainly felt here in a city that is still working on healing. We talked to people yesterday who are still struggling with all of this. And in watching the trial is sort of just ripping open wider this wound and this trauma and this sadness that they're feeling here. Morgan?
And as you mentioned, Megan, I think it's, of course, important to point out this isn't just trauma in that courtroom or even trauma in Minneapolis, but trauma that the nation is now healing from and trying to find a way forward. Yeah. Megan Fitzgerald, always a pleasure talking to you. You are such a great reporter, and we are so happy to have you on this story. Thank you, Megan. And today we are learning about new details about what sparked the federal sex trafficking investigation into Florida Congressman Matt Goetz. Law enforcement officials telling NBC News that it all began with a separate investigation into one of his associates and Seminole County tax collector Joel Greenberg. Now, he is currently awaiting trial on sex trafficking, stalking, and identity fraud charges. Greenberg has pleaded not guilty. NBC News investigations correspondent Tom Winter joins me now with more. Tom, first, give us all the backstory on Joel Greenberg. I mean, who is this guy and why is he so important?
Right. So, this would probably not be a case, Morgan, that you and I would be speaking about if it were not for the connection to the Goetz case, which I'll get into in a moment. But as far as this individual, Joel Micah Greenberg, he's the former Seminole County tax collector, and the investigation into him began about a year ago, totally unconnected to anything having to do with sex with minors or sex trafficking. It was an investigation into a letter that he sent to a rival politician, fake social media accounts, and he was charged in a stalking case. And then the investigation proceeded forward from there. The Secret Service became involved from a financial standpoint, looking at allegations that he was somehow taking money from the tax collector's office and using it to buy cryptocurrency. Then there was a potential bribery investigation involving the Small Business Administration and loans there. But in the course of that investigation, Morgan, there was an allegation of sex trafficking that was included in one of the superseding indictments. And that, we're told, is what led investigators to Matt Goetz in a possible investigation into his activities in the same arena, if you will.
But did they expand upon why that connection is, exactly how the two are linked, why one brought them to the next?
Well, it's the perfect question. And so in the 4 indictments, 3 superseding indictments plus the original one, we never see the congressman's name at all. And so there's no indication in that court paperwork about anything involving anybody else other than the person that's been charged, Greenberg here. So, no, it's not clear just yet how one investigation led into the other. And that's something that obviously we'll try to get more information and details on.
And we will be right here waiting with bated breath once you do. Tom Winter, as always, thank you so much for bringing us the latest. Well, as we speak, there is a surge of migrants in border facilities along the Rio Grande Valley, and it's the most crowded border sector, now at more than 800% capacity, with nearly 6,000 migrants of all ages crowded into facilities that are really only designed to hold about 700 people. So that's all according to data from U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I want to go right there now to NBC News Now correspondent Dasha Burns, who joins us live from McAllen, Texas. Dasha, explain something to us, because these border agents are now releasing hundreds of migrants a day, and that's all because of the overcrowding in those holding facilities. So how is that city dealing with that? I mean, what kind of strain or even new challenges are they having to face and grapple with?
Well, Morgan, there may be a new administration in the White House, but for towns like McAllen, where I stand now, and other border towns in this area, this is nothing new. They have seen this kind of increase in migration in the past. And I'll tell you, they actually have a pretty robust operation here to handle this. We've been watching as Customs and Border Protection buses drop off migrants just right here in downtown McAllen. Then the city has partnered with local NGOs who escort them to these white tents behind me here, where they get tested for COVID-19. Anyone who tests positive, they help them quarantine in a hotel room. And then Catholic Charities, which is one of the big NGOs here, takes them into their shelters, help them find tickets, plane tickets, bus tickets to get to their relatives. Most people that come here do have family living across the country, and that is the trend that we've been seeing here. And again, this city, everyone that I've been talking to here says they were actually pretty prepared for this because they've seen this in the past, although right now, Morgan, I'll tell you, the numbers are increasing. Just a couple of weeks ago, they were seeing about 200 migrants dropped off here a day. Now those numbers are more like 400 to 500, and some days as high as 700 people dropped off right here in downtown McAllen, Morgan.
It's interesting, Dasha, that you say that the city was almost prepared for this or expecting this, because it sounds like an all-hands-on-deck situation. But, this is all happening despite the Biden administration saying that only unaccompanied minors are being allowed to stay in the United States. So what do local officials there make of the administration's response to this border surge?
Yeah, well, Morgan, the reality, especially here in the Rio Grande Valley, where most of the families are crossing the border, is that the majority of families that come to the border here are allowed into the United States and are being released because of capacity issues here in these facilities. And looking at just the numbers from Saturday, for example, about 1,700 encounters with migrants traveling in family units. Only about 300 of those were expelled back into Mexico. The rest were allowed to stay here. But as I said, nothing new for the town of McAllen. I spoke to the mayor here, Mayor Jim Darling. He's been in office since 2013, so he saw similar circumstances here both in 2014 and in 2019. And he said the city was quite prepared for this. They were expecting it, but they were a little bit surprised about how the Biden administration handled it. Take a listen.
I heard something the other day where the president said, it wasn't a surprise, we didn't get surprised because we know it happens every winter. Well, if you knew it happened every winter, why are we so unprepared? I just thought, I thought they should have been better prepared for that in what's happening now. And I just, you get the sense of it's not getting any better. Look at our numbers. It's not getting any better, and there's really no solution to it.
Do you feel like McAllen was more prepared than the federal government for this?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. It only took us a day. We're up and running. We closed our homeless shelter and turned it into a respite center in a day. We have 1 day's notice.
And Morgan, as much as they've seen this before, what they've also seen before is the politics, the divisiveness that happens every single time, where he says he's seen Democrats come, Democrats go to the shelters, Republicans come, they go with Border Patrol on those ride-alongs, and then they hold press conferences and they go to Washington and they don't talk to each other. And that's perhaps the most frustrating part for local officials here. They want to see bipartisan solutions on this, Morgan.
Now, Dasha, I know we just heard from Mayor Darling, but before we let you go, just briefly, tell me a little bit more about Governor Abbott, because he was also in the Rio Grande Valley today talking about efforts that the state launched last month along the border. So what is the governor of Texas saying about this surge?
Yeah, he was here. He was talking about Operation Lone Star, which is an operation where he's enlisted Texas DPS to what he says, quote, fill in the gaps as Border Patrol has their hands full with the migrant families that are coming to the area. His focus is security. There was a lot of, as we talk about politics, a lot of finger pointing at the Biden administration for not doing enough. Take a listen to just some of what he said today.
Bottom line is this. Operation Lone Star is doing everything they can to keep our community safe. But this problem is not going to be fixed until the Biden administration does its job to secure our border and to get this crisis under control.
But Morgan, in the meantime, when you get back down to the local level, what I'm hearing is rather than DPS, rather than more boots on the ground, what they could actually use is social workers, folks to help with the humanitarian aspect of this. I actually asked Governor Abbott about that at the press conference, whether he was going to send any of those kinds of resources to deal with the human element of the situation, the migrant families, the children. And he said that should be the responsibility of the federal government. Morgan.
All right. Dasha, thank you so much for your reporting there in McAllen, Texas. We really appreciate your hard work, Dasha. Now to new information, the California shooting that killed 4 people, including a child. It happened just Wednesday at an office complex in Orange, where the suspect and another person were injured. This is now the 3rd mass shooting in just over 2 weeks in our country. NBC News correspondent Steve Patterson joins us now live from Orange, California with more. Steve, these stories are always so difficult to report. They're difficult to watch as viewers. Law enforcement did identify a suspect and a motive at the shooting at a press conference just this afternoon. What do we know so far?
Well, I think first and most importantly is that this was a targeted shooting, according to police. This was not random. This was not happenstance. This was not a crime of passion. According to police, this was a very pre-planned attack from a person that specifically knew a group of people and specifically wanted to hurt them. Police saying that they probably had personal or business-like relationships between all of the parties involved. So again, this was a targeted attack from the suspect. We've also learned the suspect's age and name. It's pretty much all we know about him at this point. 44-year-old Amin Adab Gonzalez, a resident of Fullerton, which is very nearby to where I'm standing right now. That suspect, as you mentioned, in the hospital in critical condition after suffering a gunshot wound. It's not known if he took that wound from an exchange of fire with police who arrived on the scene pretty quickly, or if it was self-inflicted. But I want to play for you, as you mentioned, an initial motive has been laid out. Here is how officials are describing it. Listen to this.
The preliminary motive is believed to be related to a business and personal relationship, which existed between the suspect and all of the victims. It appears all of the adults were connected either by business or a personal relationship, and this was not a random act of violence. The child is believed to be the son of one of the victims who worked at the business.
On scene, police discovering a handgun and a backpack with pepper spray and other assorted items. They're also looking at the fact that the suspects, apparently, according to police, used padlocks or bicycle locks to bolt both sides of the gate, the entrance and the exit, ostensibly keeping his victims locked in and keeping police locked out as he took aim. Police arriving on scene, hearing gunshots, taking fire, going in, but not being able to do much until bolt cutters arrived on the scene. Just a horrific sounding scene, according to police, Morgan.
I mean, horrific is an understatement, Steve. And, you know, whenever we do these stories, we always learn so much about the suspects. We now know about Mr. Gonzalez. But what about the victims? I mean, tell us, what do we know about the 4 people killed?
Yeah, so 2 women, a man, and a 9-year-old boy. And now, obviously, police still investigating, still trying to piece together the relationship to everybody. That boy, apparently the son of one of the people that worked in there, the victims, all people, again, who knew each other, all related to the same situation, to the same scenario with the shooter. Police saying that they discovered that 9-year-old boy in the arms of a woman, and that woman was trying to safeguard from the shooter as the boy was killed. We don't know if it was the boy's mother. Ostensibly, police and the district attorney said that in the press conference. They alluded to the fact that this may have been the boy's caretaker or even mother. But just the mere fact that that's how they discovered some of the victims, who, by the way, were found in multiple locations. And what's being described as a 2-story scene with a courtyard that's also being investigated as well. All part of the investigation as they continue to push forward for why this happened. Morgan?
I mean, that's even that scene, you know, a little boy in a woman's arms. It's unconscionable. And you've covered so many of these mass shootings, Steve. I mean, we're talking 3 mass shootings in 2 weeks. This is coming on the heels of Atlanta. This is coming off the heels of Boulder, Colorado. While you're there in Orange, what are people telling you about what it's like to live through something like this when it hits so close to home, when it's your home?
Well, first of all, I mean, I just left Boulder. I just touched down in California, and then another mass shooting, as you mentioned. And the 2 cities are so similar. Boulder, about 100,000 people, Here in Orange, about 130,000. Boulder, always listed on those lists of one of the best places to live. Here in Orange, this is like 6 miles from Disneyland. So I think people are kind of waking up to the reality that this could happen to anyone at any time, anywhere. This one, obviously a targeted shooting, and I think officials really wanted to get that out to give people a sense of peace, a sense of calm. But it's still, it's all that's shattered because they're waking up to another shooting. First of all, in disbelief that it's happening in our country at all,
right.
And then with the fact that it's happening in people's backyards, I think it's really unbelievable. I think a state of shock has settled over this community in particular, and I think it will turn into mourning and agony as the days move forward, unfortunately. We're hoping that there's a healing moment in all of this, but we haven't had a chance to catch our breath long enough to find it. So that's the problem I think we're all facing at this point, Morgan.
Which is the sad part, right? Because this is the reality that we shouldn't have to face. All right, Steve Patterson joining us live from Orange, California. Steve, as always, thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's go now to NBC News Now correspondent Simone Boyce, who is following the latest headlines from NBCnews.com. Simone, what do you have for us this afternoon?
Hey, Morgan, we're starting with a tragic and shocking story out of Cancun, where 2 pilots died during a gender reveal stunt. After releasing a pink cloud into the air, their plane took a nosedive into the ocean while the expectant parents caught it all on video. Authorities are still investigating what happened there. And in some coronavirus vaccine news, Pfizer and BioNTech saying the results from clinical trials suggest that their vaccine is effective against the South African variant. The companies also say their vaccine has given people high levels of protection from the virus as much as 6 months after their second dose. Well, the Virginia Supreme Court today ruling the city of Charlottesville can take down 2 statues of Confederate generals. One of those statues is of General Robert E. Lee. Now, this Lee statue was the focus of that deadly white nationalist rally in 2017, which left 1 woman dead. And Major League Baseball announcing tonight's opening game between the Mets and the Nationals is postponed after a player for the Nationals tested positive for the coronavirus. The MLB also saying that out of an abundance of caution, the game will also not be played on Friday. And a judge has ruled that the streetwear brand Mischief has to stop filling orders on their controversial Satan Shoes collaboration with rapper Lil Nas X after Nike filed a trademark infringement lawsuit. Had to say a lot of people saw that one coming. Morgan, I'll send it back to you.
That's right, Simone. Simone, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And this afternoon, President Biden holding his first cabinet meeting at the White House. The meeting comes as the Biden administration gears up to get his $2 trillion infrastructure plan through Congress. NBC News White House correspondent Monica Abba joins us now from Washington, D.C. Monica, let's talk more about the American Jobs Plan, because we know that's the main focus of today's meeting. But what else did the Biden cabinet discuss?
And we just learned, Morgan, that meeting, the first official cabinet meeting of the Biden administration, lasted more than 2 hours. So they had a lot on the agenda, but most of the time was set aside for how to move forward on this infrastructure plan, because it really touches so many of the agencies that were represented in this meeting that you see there, socially distanced in the East Room instead of the so-called cabinet room where these would generally take place. But of course, in the midst of the health crisis, this administration very conscious of that, and we saw everybody in there wearing masks as well. But the president was really sort of handing out homework assignments for 5 cabinet secretaries in particular. That's transportation, energy, commerce, labor, and HUD. And he wants them to be the ones really as the point people reaching out to members of Congress to try to sell this infrastructure plan and also try to get a sense of what the American public most like about the proposal. Take a listen to how President Biden framed this and what he wants to get back from his cabinet secretaries in the coming weeks.
Today, I'm announcing that I'm asking 5 cabinet members to take special responsibility to explain the plan to the American public. Working with my team here in the White House, these cabinet members will represent me in dealing with Congress, engage the public in selling the plan, and help work out the details as we refine it and move forward.
Now, Morgan, this cabinet meeting was very different than what we were accustomed to seeing under former President Trump, where those cabinet gatherings sometimes lasted an hour or longer, where he would want cameras in there documenting his own officials, heaping praise on him, fawning over him. That is not at all anything of the sort that we saw today. In fact, none of the cabinet officials spoke on camera. It was just the president offering those very brief remarks, thanking the press, and then saying, hi, we need to get back to work, and we're going to do that behind closed doors.
A stark change. And it's interesting you described sort of these homework assignments. Let's talk a little bit about bipartisan support, because, you know, the White House will have to win over Republicans to get infrastructure passed. In fact, let's take a listen for a second to what Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg said on MSNBC just this morning.
I'm not going to give up on earning Republican support for this, because we know that Republicans and Democrats across America believe this is a good idea. I know sometimes Washington doesn't mirror the American people, but I've had a lot of conversations on both sides of the aisle with members of Congress who care about this, too.
So, Monica, what does the other side look like? Because, you know, talking with Republicans is one thing, but what else is the administration actually doing to get that GOP support?
And President Biden said, just like with his COVID relief bill, he is happy to invite Republicans to the White House, to the Oval Office, to have these face-to-face meetings and discussions about maybe where they can find common ground. But we all remember what happened just a few short weeks ago. There weren't any Republicans who got on board with that American Rescue Plan. In the end, Democrats were able to pass it through a process known as budget reconciliation, which didn't require any GOP votes. So now the White House is saying, again, at the outset, we're going to try to get Republicans on board by asking them for their ideas as well and seeing if maybe they have other proposals and seeing if they can come to some sort of compromise. So a slightly different approach, Morgan, than what we saw in terms of trying to get relief to the American people so immediately when it comes to the pandemic.
And let's switch gears for a moment, Monica. Just before I let you go, I want to talk about Vice President Harris for a moment because she's launching a new public education campaign on COVID-19 today with the Surgeon General. What exactly is the goal and how are they planning to get that message out there?
This is so important, Morgan, because the White House, while they're very happy so far with how they're doing on vaccines and meeting their own milestones and goals, they are worried, they say, about vaccine hesitancy, and particularly in some communities of color where people may feel they don't have enough information about how to access the vaccine and what the implications could be. That's why they have the vice president now really trying to lead a campaign called the COVID-19 Community Corps, where they're going to try to dispel any myths and really get people the information to make this decision to then critically get those shots in arms. They really want to see these numbers go up, but it was a question of access and supply. Right now, a lot of people still can't get it, but as more states open eligibility, they're hoping, again, these hard-hit communities are the ones who can really get in line as quickly as possible, Morgan.
Access, supply, and a little bit of trust. Monica Alba, thank you so much for joining us live from the White House. We really appreciate it. And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is ready to rally Democrats on the Hill behind that Biden infrastructure plan.
The joy of the season is marked by another renewal, the renewal of Reconstruction. President Biden is undertaking something in the tradition of thinking big, being transformational, and creating jobs for America.
NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Leanne Caldwell joins us now. Leanne, House Democrats were united behind passing that $1.9 trillion COVID relief plan. So where exactly does the party stand when it comes to infrastructure?
Hey, Morgan. Well, they do want to pass a big infrastructure plan. That's where they are united, but they're going to have a lot more work to do to get everyone on the same page. You have some moderate Democrats who are saying that they don't want to move forward unless there's what's called the SALT deduction, the state and local tax deduction in that plan. Speaker Pelosi today said that she is actually supportive of that and she hopes it is included. And then on the other side, on the left, you have progressives who are saying that this plan is not big enough. Let's listen to Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on Rachel Maddow last night.
If we're looking at ideals and what we think is the actual investment that can create tens of millions of good union jobs in this country, that can shore up our healthcare, our infrastructure, our housing, and doing it in a way that draws down our carbon emissions to help us get in line with the IPCC standards, we're talking about realistically $10 trillion over 10 years.
So the Biden plan is $2.25 trillion, nowhere near $10 trillion. So Democrats are going to have a lot of work to do to either get people on the same page or come up with a proposal that does, Morgan.
And talking about getting people on the same page, Leanne, I mean, over on the Republican side, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is calling the American Jobs Plan a Trojan horse for taxes. So frankly, is there any room for negotiations with the GOP?
It's going to be very difficult at this point to get Republicans on board. There's other Republicans who are calling this an infrastructure bill, but using the quotes around the word infrastructure. They don't like that so much of the money goes to climate change component, to the elderly, things that aren't traditional infrastructure things. You know, I caught up with House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy in Iowa yesterday, and I asked him about what he thinks about the Biden plan. Let's take a listen to what he said, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
I am one as a Republican that would like to sit down and find a bipartisan bill on infrastructure. Let's work to build roads, our highways, our bridges, but also let's do the Wi-Fi. If that's the criteria, we're more than willing to work with them. But if it's about tax increases in the Green New Deal, I think that's a hard thing to sell.
So the reality is that Republicans and Democrats have much different ideas of what this infrastructure package should look like. So it's going to be very difficult to get Republicans to sign off on this, Morgan.
Well, we will wait and see. All right, Leanne Caldwell, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And stay with us.
Yep.
719,000 Americans filed for first-time unemployment last week, according to the Labor Department. That's a higher number than economists were expecting as the economy still struggles to recover from the pandemic. NBC News business and technology correspondent Jo Ling Kent joins me now to dig into those numbers. Joe, explain this for us, because 719,000 is a higher number than many people were expecting. But when you look at it, continuing claims are actually declining. So what does that actually tell us about the state of economic recovery?
Hey, Morgan, good afternoon. You're absolutely right. If you see these numbers go up, it's a bad sign. But last week, or the prior week, I should say, we actually saw the lowest levels since the height of the pandemic. So when you put it together and look at the trend line, we're actually moving in the right direction. So as you said, continuing claims dropping, that is good news, dropped down to about 3.8 million. And then overall, when you look at how many American workers are collecting some kind of unemployment, it's down to about 18 million. That's a pretty significant drop from the prior week of about 1.5 million claims. So certainly moving in the right direction as more states and cities and counties are opening up. You've got more vaccinations going into arms.
Which is interesting because you talk about things opening up, and when you compare that to the data this time a year ago, there were 6 million people who filed for unemployment benefits. So when you see these COVID restrictions lifting and people can kind of start to go back to work, what else has to happen? What else really needs to occur in order to speed up our economic recovery?
It's all about demand, right? And driving demand. And so you'll see these stimulus checks start to hit bank accounts and people will start cashing in. That means they're going to be spending more in places that they used to spend, restaurants, leisure, travel. People will feel safe again. So they'll be getting their vaccinations and hitting the road. And so you see that demand already manifesting in gas prices, right? Gas prices going up because demand is going up and there's still some COVID restrictions on that supply. So it's good news to see this happening right now, but there's a long way to go. There's still millions of jobs missing. And we're also looking at a fundamentally different economy, right? And so a lot of jobs may not come back. What will happen to those workers? And what will happen to those who are collecting unemployment for weeks on end? But overall, we are moving in the right direction. As economists say, though, there's still a long way to go.
But given all those outstanding questions, I mean, what do you expect to see once we get the March job report just tomorrow?
Yeah, so we've been talking to economists about this, and I wanted to tell you, it's interesting. One economist told our digital team here at NBC News in the Biz Tech unit that it's going to be, quote, blistering hot, which I thought was a really interesting description. We expect unemployment to drop down to about 6%, which is good. If you think about the peak of the pandemic, it was at 14.7%. That was a really painful moment, and that's really sustained itself for quite a long time. And we expect jobs to come in at about 675,000 added back. But again, there's still millions of a deficit in terms of jobs returning to the economy. But other economists are feeling more bullish about it. They think it could be upwards of 1 million jobs added, maybe come April, May, June. And so it all depends on vaccinations, people spending more, people going back to work and feeling safe to do so. That's why when we look at all of these reports of the rising number of cases alongside rising vaccinations, there is concern from economists. Like, what does this mean for the economy to fully recover in the next 6 to 12 months? But as the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, keeps on saying, this is not a recovery that's going to be over by the time the end of summer hits, for example. We're going to be at this for a long time, Morgan.
Which is hard to hear because we are all just dying to get back to normal, whatever normal means. So, Joe, thank you, because we needed you to break these numbers down for us today. And we look forward to hearing from you again tomorrow.
Thanks,
when that
Morgan.
jobs report comes out. Thanks so much, Joe. Appreciate you. Democratic State Representative Park Cannon is speaking out for the first time since her arrest just last week. Now, she was arrested for knocking on the governor's door as he signed the controversial voting law.
As horrible as that experience was, and as difficult as it is to acknowledge that I am facing 8 years in prison on unfounded charges. I believe the governors signing into law the most comprehensive voter suppression bill in the country is a far more serious crime.
Major corporations are now also taking a stand against the new law. NBC News correspondent Blaine Alexander has the latest developments from Atlanta, Georgia.
Well, Morgan, hello to you. Right now, I'm standing outside of the World of Coca-Cola right here in downtown Atlanta. Typically, this is a museum. This is kind of a tourist attraction where people can come in, learn about the history of Coke, taste different Coke flavors. But today, earlier today, it was actually the grounds for the start and call for a boycott. We saw a number of religious leaders here, led by the bishop of the 6th Episcopal District of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, essentially saying that they're calling on all of their church members, all people, to boycott not only Coca-Cola, but Delta Airlines and a number of other Georgia businesses. Now, of course, this all goes back to that voting legislation that was signed into law just a week ago by Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. The activists today say that, yes, it's too little too late for what happened here in Georgia. They acknowledge that the ship has already sailed here. It's already been signed into law. But what they're now calling on these corporations to do is speak out very forcefully against similar legislation in different states across the country, other legislation that they say would severely limit the right to vote in other states nationwide. Let's hear a little bit from that news conference. Take a look.
Well, we cannot and will not support companies who do not support us in our struggle to cast our ballots and exercise our freedom. That's right. And we cannot support companies who support or remain silent about legislation that is based on a lie, that seeks to suppress our vote, is racist, and seeks to turn back time to Jim Crow.
So, Morgan, of course, all of this comes after we're hearing the strongest language yet from these corporations. Both the CEO of Delta and the CEO of Coca-Cola have called the legislation unacceptable. But again, the organizers here today said that they want to hear more than just paper statements. They want these corporations rather, to kind of use their resources and fight against what they call legislation that's going to limit the right to vote. Now, as all of this is happening, Morgan, we're also hearing from State Representative Park Cannon. Of course, she's the Georgia lawmaker who was arrested 1 week ago today when she was trying to knock on the office door of Georgia Governor Brian Kemp as he signed that legislation. She spoke out for the very first time since that arrest. Take a look.
I am not ashamed to admit that I was afraid of what might happen. The recurring questions flooding my mind were, why are they doing this?
And Morgan, there are certainly a lot of voices, a lot of people that are adding their voices to the conversation. We're also hearing from more than 70 black business executives who have signed a letter essentially saying that corporations, their fellow corporations, need to do more to oppose this legislation around the country. That effort was being led by Ken Chenault and Ken Frazier, of course, the former CEO of American Express and the current CEO of Merck, respectively. I spoke with both of them yesterday and I asked them, how did this idea come about? And they said it was a series of emails between black executives essentially saying, hey, we need to do something. What can we do? And when I pressed them on it, I talked to them more about it. They said this was very personal for them, and they realized that they couldn't just sit down and they had to do something. Morgan?
A lot on the line there in Georgia. That was NBC's Blaine Alexander. A former employee of a group home in Kalamazoo, Michigan, is speaking out now for the very first time, describing an incident where a teen died after he was restrained by that facility's staff members. Now, the facility was operated by Sequel Youth and Family Services, a for-profit company that NBC News has been investigating for more than 2 years. NBC News senior national correspondent Kate Snow has more on this story, but just a warning for our viewers, the video you're about to see may be disturbing.
Is he breathing? Is the child breathing?
Police body cam video obtained by NBC News shows the response to an incident caught on surveillance camera. 16-year-old Cornelius Frederick threw a piece of food in the cafeteria at Lakeside Academy in Kalamazoo, Michigan, a group youth home run by Sequel Youth and Family Services. When he did it again, staff shoved him to the ground and piled on top of him. After more than 10 minutes, he was limp. Another 12 minutes passed before a nurse called 911.
We have assumed that he was in a restraint, and now he's unresponsive.
This is what she later told police.
Initially, I was like, we thought he was just faking.
Cornelius died 2 days later in a hospital.
I'm still angry.
You were his case manager. You knew him.
Yeah.
Megan Fulkerson worked at Lakeside for 2 years. This is her in red walking into the cafeteria when Cornelius was already on the ground.
Unfortunately, if you had asked majority of our staff 6 months prior, we probably could have told you this was going to happen.
Sequel calls Cornelius's death senseless and tragic and says staff did not follow policies and training. Marianne Birmingham is Senior Director of Compliance and Quality Management.
The use of restraint is only when there is an imminent or immediate danger to the client themselves or others.
But Fulkerson says excessive restraints were used often.
Even though they say, hey, this is last resort, they didn't necessarily train what your other avenues were. It just seemed like those restraints were your go-to.
3 former employees, including the nurse, were charged with manslaughter. All pleaded not guilty. In a police interview, Zachary Solis said Sequel management initially told him he'd done nothing wrong.
They said everything was straight, nothing was foul, nothing went wrong. We did a good job. We did what we were trained to do.
Sequel says Solis and other staff were swiftly terminated for their participation in the restraint.
Sequel is an agency, a company composed of thousands of people who've committed their lives to helping, some of our most underserved kids.
But Megan Fulkerson says there needs to be change.
I just feel like something needs to come of this. I don't want Cornelius's death to just go away.
NBC News senior national correspondent Kate Snow joins us now. Kate, I have to say that video is hard to watch, but it's doubly difficult to watch in the context of George Floyd and what we're seeing now during the Chauvin trial. And it reminds us, so many of us who not only report on these stories and those of us who look like the people who are victimized in these situations, that there are so many other situations that are happening across the country that we can't even see. So my first question, what has Sequel said, and are they still in business?
They are still in business. They continue to operate in 19 states right now. Now, Lakeside Academy, where that incident happened, Morgan, that place has gone away because Michigan shut it down. Here's what Sequel says. It just popped up on your screen. This is part of their statement. The company says the overwhelming majority of state child serving agencies in the United States continue to find our services to be essential and operating at or exceeding their highest standards. So their argument is that, Cornelius's death was tragic, they say, but these allegations of abuse and assault and overuse of restraints, they will say, are aberrations. They're not things that happen commonly. Of course, that's not what someone like Megan Fulkerson, who you just heard, says.
Yeah, and a lot of people, Kate, would say that's simply not enough, that calling it tragic and acknowledging that it's tragic is not enough for that young man's family and for, again, the people who look like him for whom that sends a ripple through their community of fear. So walk us through how group homes like this one make a profit. I mean, that's what I'm concerned about, and also what services are they actually providing?
Well, they say they're providing all kinds of therapeutic services, educational services, and housing, obviously, and support. Now, the model, though, is that a company like Sequel makes money off of every kid that gets sent to the facilities, right? Wow. So states like California, Oregon, Washington were sending kids to other states, to Sequel facilities, and paying. We've found records, Morgan, that they were paying hundreds of dollars per day per child.
Unbelievable.
In the case of Michigan, one more thing, the Lakeside Academy that we were just talking about, we've been able to uncover that California counties were paying sometimes twice as much as Michigan was paying to put kids in this place in Kalamazoo. What that led to was, according to Megan Fulkerson, an increase in the number of kids coming in from California because she says that it was all about the money and, they wanted to make as much as they could. Look, this is a business. Businesses are allowed to make a profit. I think what gets questioned is how exactly they're making that much of a profit. We found records that they're making upwards of $200 million a year in some years, Morgan.
Which is staggering, especially when you hear that caseworker who you interviewed say that she could have seen this coming 6 months ago, right? That children are in this care and that this is happening. Kate, thank you so much for reporting. I'm so glad you told that story. I know, for one, I am interested to learn more. And for all of our viewers out there who would also like to learn more about Kate's investigation into the for-profit companies who are running these group homes, you can watch her Children That Pay. It's a special this Sunday at 10 p.m. Eastern on MSNBC, and you do not want to miss it. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. In the United Kingdom, 50% of adults have received at least one dose of a coronavirus vaccine. And so far, the daily number of new cases in the UK is falling more than in any other country. On Sunday, for the second time this year, London reported 0 COVID deaths. Here's NBC News foreign correspondent Molly Hunter with more.
Hey, Morgan, that's right. Some really good news. The UK is doing this really well. Now, look, it's a smaller country than the US, about 66 million people. But the fact that they have already offered the first dose and then given the first dose to 50% of adults here in the UK, that's about 30 million people, is huge, and a lot more than our neighbors over here. Now, one of the things the UK has done in those clinical trials for the vaccines that require 2 doses, like Pfizer, like Moderna, like the Oxford AstraZeneca, the clinical trials suggest a distance, a time between those 2 doses is about 3 to 4 weeks. What the UK has done early on is basically prioritize the first doses. So they spread out that window between the 2 doses to 10 to 12 weeks, which means you prioritize, you double down on that first dose, and a lot more people get it. Now, we spoke with a virologist here about why they did it and also why it's working really well. Take a listen.
The thinking behind this decision was to give more people at least some protection. You could give one person 90% protection, or you could give 2 people 50 or 60% protection. And actually, it looks like one dose actually is giving more than 50 or 60% protection. And the bulk of the protection is given through the first dose. And so that's really helped the UK to bring cases down faster. I can understand, I certainly felt this at the beginning, that it seems strange to deviate from the protocols from the clinical trials, given they'd given such fantastic results. But the proof is in the situation in the UK, where I think everyone is delighted with how well it's going.
Now, the reason we are able to start coming out of a very strict lockdown, Morgan, we've been in lockdown for the past about 3.5 months. We're counting down the days until April 12th. That's when outdoor dining resumes. You can go get a pint at a pub and sit outdoors with some friends. And what I'm excited about is that you can get a haircut. But all of that could not be more different than what's happening in France. So France has announced they are going into essentially what amounts to a lockdown light. So President Emmanuel Macron announced a curfew, 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. starting this weekend. You better be indoors. You can go outside for essential things. You no longer have to carry government paperwork. So Morgan, last year when there was a national lockdown, you literally had to have a piece of paper from the government that you signed saying what your essential reason was to go out. The big difference in France for the next 4 weeks, schools will be closed. But other than that, only essential shops will stay open, including, though, Morgan, wine shops, chocolate shops, and hairdressers. The French have deemed those essential. But all of this is happening in France because their vaccination rollout has been so slow. So their cases are rising really high. Their ICU beds are filling up. They've vaccinated only 12% of their adult population, whereas here we're at about 50%. Our cases are falling faster than almost anywhere in the world. And last week, Morgan, we had one of the first days in months where there were 0 COVID-related deaths. Morgan?
Good news packed in that report. That was NBC's Molly Hunter. In 2020, fewer than half of Americans belong to a church, a synagogue, a mosque, and that's more than a 20-point drop compared to 2 decades ago, according to Gallup. So the question is, why is religious membership falling in the U.S.? NBC News Now correspondent Simone Boyce takes a look.
Do you believe in God? Almost 90% of Americans say yes. But when you ask people if they attend a church, synagogue, or mosque, the numbers tell a very different story. In fact, a new Gallup poll shows only 47% of U.S. adults say they belong to a house of worship. It's the first time religious membership has dropped below 50% since Gallup started tracking this metric more than 80 years ago. But the data isn't exactly surprising. For decades, church membership hovered around the 70% mark. Starting around the year 2000, that number began to steadily fall. This was around the time another trend started taking off. The rise of nuns. And no, not those kind of nuns. By nuns, we mean Americans who don't associate themselves with any formal religion.
They describe themselves as atheist or agnostic, or say there's simply nothing in particular with respect to religion. It would be a mistake to think of all of them as atheists or as totally secular in their worldview, but they are far less religiously observant.
Dr. Gregory Smith researches religion and public life for the Pew Research Center. He says the number of religiously unaffiliated Americans has jumped over the last decade, from 17% of the U.S. population in 2009 to 26% in 2019.
One big driver of the growth of the nuns is that young adults are coming of age, they're entering adulthood with far lower levels of attachment to religion than their parents and grandparents before them. The other thing I would mention is a theory proposed by many scholars that says that the growth of the religious nuns is really in some ways bound up with politics. And there's a variety of ways in which that's true. One way is that as religion in the United States began to be associated, at least in the popular imagination, with right-wing politics, with conservative politics, so the thinking goes. Religious people who don't share those politics increasingly began to describe themselves as religious nuns.
And while it's too soon to tell, it's possible the pandemic is also putting a temporary strain on religious membership. Many places of worship were forced to close during stay-at-home orders, but so far, most Americans say COVID-19 hasn't had an impact on their faith.
There are some people, about a quarter of the population, who say their religious faith has grown stronger. They tended to be the most religious people. So it was people who told us before the pandemic that they were deeply religious, who say that now because of the pandemic, they've become even more religious. There are far fewer people who weren't particularly religious to begin with, who say they've become more faithful as a result of the pandemic.
Here's one thing we know for sure. The rise of the nuns is happening across America. And there's no signs the trend is slowing down anytime soon.
Nuns are growing in every region of the country. Nuns are growing among both women and men. Nuns are growing among white Americans, among Black Americans, and among Hispanic Americans. Nuns are growing among college graduates and among those with less than a college degree. That consistency of this trend, that uniformity of this trend, the fact that the growth of the nuns is happening among every social and demographic group we can examine is very striking to me.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.